Hi, everyone. I am so sorry that I can't be with you live today, but I really appreciate everyone that is watching for taking the time to listen. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Danielle Fitch. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I actually work at Community Presbyterian Counseling Center. Been there since about 2012, and I love what I do. And this is actually the second time I've had the chance to speak at Mothers Together. Of course, the last time I spoke, the world looked very different. So on that note, when Jackie reached out to me about speaking again, one of the first things that she asked me was, what are some of the things that I'm seeing the most this last year in my practice that would potentially be really good to speak on today? So that leads me into introducing what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. And when I sat with that question, the first thing that came to mind was anxiety. I don't know if anyone listening had any experience with anxiety this last year, but I can tell you across the board, that was the thing that I saw the most often come up was anxiousness. But very specifically, because anxiety is not new, in relation to this last year, what I really noticed was it was anxiety around the unknown. And more specifically, this idea of things being uncertain had brought up a lot of anxiety for not only the people that I was seeing in sessions, but even just in conversations with friends, with family. And in total transparency, I think even in my own household, there was anxiety around the uncertainty of what life was looking like. And so I sat with that, prayed about it, and I realized I think this would be something really important to talk about from a clinical perspective, what I see as uncertainty and how do we find hope. So today we're going to talk about hope in the midst of uncertainty. And I'm going to take a very clinical approach to kind of give everyone listening an idea of, what does that word uncertainty mean? How does it impact me? And this concept of finding hope in the midst of uncertainty from a mental health perspective. So I'm going to share some slides with you. And give me 1 second. I'm going to pull this up. I think we are ready to go. Okay, awesome. So again, my name is Danielle, and today we are going to spend some time chatting about hope in the midst of uncertainty. The first thing that I want to, I think, acknowledge is, everyone that's watching, whether you are new to faith, whether faith has been a lifelong journey for you. I'm going to be totally honest here. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a theologian, so I can't go super deep into depth about what scripture has to say. But, one thing I can share with you as a fellow believer is that faith has been such an anchor for, I know, me and a lot of my clients in terms of holding on to things like hope in the midst of an anxious season. And I just wanted to show you guys, and this is just a very, very small, brief example of scriptures that really address things like depression and anxiety and hopelessness and grief. There's so many examples throughout the Bible, but I think it's important to name the fact that it is something that shows up throughout scripture. And today, the verse that I really want you guys to keep in mind is, I wrote it down, it's in 2 Philippians, and it has to do with being anxious for nothing. So we're going to come back and talk about that. But this is just to remind you that this is not anything new. Anxiety and uncertainty is throughout scripture. So you are not alone in experiencing that. So today I want to address 3 questions. The first question being, how does uncertainty affect our mental health? How do we deal with uncertainty? And lastly, can we hold hope in the midst of uncertainty? And if so, how do we do that? So let's start with 2 things that kind of go hand in hand, and that is uncertainty and anxiety. So right out the gate, I think it's important to remind you that not all anxiety is bad. I'm sure you've heard that before, but in a very just, layman's terms, anxiety is what literally keeps us alive, right? It is our body's alert system. Anxiety is what lets us know that there's potentially a physical threat that could do us harm. And so some anxiety within us is a good thing. We don't want to get rid of anxiety. But the difference is there's also really unhealthy anxiety. And that is when we find ourselves having those same reactions that we would have to a physical threat, but there is no physical threat present. That's when anxiety can really take over our life. So when we think about being in a very uncertain, very unknown season of life, it makes sense that there's going to be a lot of anxiety attached to that. Just to put this, by the way, into perspective, over this last year, some anxiety was probably a good thing, right? So that anxiety reminded you of moments that you needed to keep yourself and your loved ones safe. There was a very real threat that was happening throughout the year in multiple ways, and some anxiety kept you and your loved ones safe. But the honest truth is most anxiety is simply the fear of the unknown, right? Things that are out of my control, things that I don't have answers to, things that are uncertain and really have no resolve to them. How could that not bring a level of anxiousness? We want answers. We find safety in control. We find safety in having an answer and a plan. And when those things don't exist, it immediately activates this anxiousness in us, right? We want to go back to what makes us feel safe. When anxiety has no resolve, when it goes completely uninterrupted and it just kind of runs rampant, it has this snowball effect where one small anxiety starts to turn into 2 to 3 to 4, and it literally snowballs until our anxiety is so massive that that is the only thing blocking our view. Another default for, I know there's probably a lot of people that experience this, is when things are unknown or things are out of our control, we tend to go to worst case scenario. In therapy, we call that catastrophizing. So there's a lot of what we call cognitive distortions, which I won't get into today, but essentially when our logical, objective brain goes to anxiousness, it basically distorts our rational thinking. Anxiety comes in and it messes with our thinking. So everything is distorted. And one way that that distortion can show up is catastrophizing. So every situation we immediately go to, what is the worst potential outcome that could happen? And lastly, anxiety thrives on uncertainty. When we feel like we have the answer to something or things feel very certain, I don't really have a reason to feel anxious. But let's transition into more specifically something called worry and uncertainty. So the danger of uncertainty is it's not a tangible thing that we can escape from. If there is a very physical threat right in front of me that I can remove myself from, there's a level of control in that. Uncertainty is not something that we can necessarily see in front of us, so we can't physically escape from it. So the way that we tend to deal with that is either we avoid, which is actually something that every single person I guarantee you I'm talking to has experienced. Avoidance can look like a lot of different things. So keeping busy, distracting ourselves, that's a way that we avoid the uncertainty. But another way that we tend to deal with the uncertainty is we fixate on it. This might be something that you're consciously doing or something that you're completely unaware that you're doing. But here's what I mean. We will think about the things that are question marks, the things that are uncertain, and we fixate on them. And we try to analyze it and figure it out. And we somehow think that this will help get rid of the uncertainty. This is actually the act of worrying. So in many ways, we think that what we're doing is helpful. If I can just get this figured out, if I can find the answer, then I'll be able to control it. I will be able to, if I think of the worst case scenario, plan for anything and be prepared so I won't be caught off guard. So again, we think that what we're doing is healthy and helpful and productive, but what we're actually doing is fixating on the uncertainty, and this is the act of worrying. Sometimes worrying can look like reassurance. So if you've ever had something that you feel like is out of your control or that you don't have answers to, instead of sitting and accepting the fact that I don't have answers to this and that's okay, we will often seek reassurance. So we will seek a second or a third or a fourth opinion. And part of what we're doing, even if we get the same answer every time, is it becomes our comfort to just seek reassurance. We tend to view worry as necessary to avoid uncertainty. So, by that, I mean, what we're essentially doing is allowing worry to distract us from the reality that I don't have an answer and I may never have an answer. That is terrifying. And so we will do everything we can, consciously or unconsciously, to avoid having to sit in that uncertainty. So let's talk about how do we actually deal with that uncertainty, because the reality is, over this last year, probably the biggest thing we all experienced was the unknown, the uncertainty of everything, right? And it's not going to be the last time that you have to deal with uncertainty. So I think it's really important for us to talk about how do we deal with uncertainty. So the very first one, it sounds obvious, but it is hands down going to be the hardest thing you ever do. You have to simply sit and accept the unknown. The first step in accepting what we can't control is the hardest step, but that is the most important one. And I mean a literal sitting in the stillness and accepting, verbalizing out loud to yourself, I have to accept what I don't know. The reality is there are things happening right now that are out of our control and that are very uncertain. And the longer that we avoid accepting that, then the further we are keeping ourselves from going through a process of rest and finding hope. So we have to accept the unknown. Secondly, leave your worry questions unanswered. Again, this kind of goes with step one. A lot of clients I talk to, when they will come in and it will almost be this verbal dump of all the things that they're freaking out about and all the questions they have. And so many of those questions, though, that they're desperately seeking answers to give them that reassurance, to give them that comfort. One of the hardest things for them to do is when I reflect back to them that a lot of those questions that you're worried about, you have to leave unanswered. Thirdly, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but I think it bears repeating, which is you have to start creating healthy limits. And I wrote down create healthy limits around news and social media, but healthy limits can be around a lot of things. But I put down the news and social media one because I guarantee you that for most people in general, but especially this last year, was the biggest trigger for their anxiety, for their panic, for their sadness. Like, you name an emotion that we felt this last year, and news and social media were probably the two biggest triggers for those. So it's important to create really healthy limits. And remember, what my boundaries and limits look like might be different than yours. So it's not about me telling you what that looks like. It's you sitting and having a very honest conversation around yourself of what are the things that tend to trigger those really unhealthy reactions to anxiety, and am I willing to put healthy limits and boundaries around those things? Fourth, focus on what you can control. When in doubt, when you find yourself completely focused on the things that are out of your control, you will notice some things. When we are focused on the external that we can't control, that is when we'll start to notice those emotional reactions, or are spiraling or imploding or getting stuck. So when in doubt, when you notice that, literally flip it inwards and focus on what you can control. And remember, what you can always control are your thoughts, your feelings, your reactions, what you focus on. In a practical sense, sometimes it's helpful to focus on what you can control. I can't control whether or not schools are going to open for my children next year. What I can control is how I am creating a healthy environment right now around how to do school at home. I can't control what other people's reactions to what's happening in the world are. What I can control is my reaction to them and what I focus on. And remember, there is a difference between burying our head in the sand and avoiding dealing with reality. There's a difference between that and the acceptance of the reality that's in front of me, but not being so focused on what I can't control, and instead taking that information and in a healthy way focusing on what I can control. And lastly, this is just a really great image that I like to give a lot of my clients who deal with anxiety is every time you feel yourself overwhelmed with anxious thoughts, imagine that each one of those thoughts is the car on a long line of a train, and simply watch it pass by. And the reason why that's important is it's number one, it's allowing yourself to actually acknowledge those anxious thoughts instead of trying to run from them, which is avoidance. Instead, I am absolutely fully acknowledging that this is an anxious thought, but I am watching it pass by until it goes off into the distance. Take a breath, recenter. Even if you have to do that like 15 times in a day, just watch those thoughts like a train passing by. Let's go to some very practical, healthy coping tips. So first and foremost, you might have heard the phrase mindfulness before, but it's one of those things I think we take for granted. Mindfulness is something that is so helpful when it comes to anxiousness, when it comes to seasons that are really uncertain, out of our control. When in doubt, start with your breath. One thing that I would really encourage you is even just Google like mindfulness tips, but there are two apps in particular that are really helpful. You might be familiar with them, but Calm and Headspace are really great apps to use for anxiety, deal with uncertainty, healthy sleeping habits. But in addition to that, I would recommend Googling something called progressive muscle relaxation. And there's actually even some great Christian ones out there that incorporate scripture into it. But it's basically just mindfulness teaching us how to be still, to pay attention to our breath, and to recenter. And the reason why this is important is when we are feeling anxious, especially if you have ever experienced a panic attack, we tend to tense up and we have very staggered breathing. So our brain is literally being deprived of oxygen. So one of the most important things that we have to do when feeling anxious is get the blood flowing, get oxygen pumped back into our brain. So it's about learning how to center, calm down. So start with intentional breath. Journaling and doing things like expressive writing is really helpful. So there's no real structure to it. Sometimes expressive writing is just sitting down and whatever comes to mind, thoughts, feelings, whatever it is, just get it onto paper. Focus on a project or something creative. This has been, I know for me personally, one of the best things when last year filled my head with a lot of questions and a lot of unknown was I like being creative that gives my brain something else to do, but it's allowing my brain to actually do something productive, but it's being used in a different way. I get to be creative and it gives you something to look forward to do, and it occupies your time in a healthy way. So give yourself a project or something creative to work on. Exercise and vitamins, I will tell you that hands down, our most basic self-care are usually the things that go first when we are stressed out. We stop making sure that we're drinking water, taking our vitamins, eating enough meals, filling ourselves with proper nutrition, getting sleep, getting exercise, getting outside. We tend to push all of those things aside. So it's really important to be intentional with exercise and vitamins. There are countless studies done about how much things like vitamin B, for example, is really important when you're feeling anxious. Faith. Now, this might look different for everybody. Everybody has different ways that they incorporate faith into their life. But faith is an important part of dealing with moments of uncertainty. And then lastly, community. Now, again, it has to be a little bit more of a creative approach right now, but we are not meant, of course, to live life alone. But I will tell you, not only does it talk about in scripture about bearing each other's burdens, but from a mental health standpoint, one of the first things we talk about when it comes to things like anxiety and depression is, what does your community look like? Are you connected to people? Are you actually reaching out and staying connected? Be in community. In times of uncertainty, focus on the circle around you and the people that you can invest in and that can invest in you. That intentionality is so imperative when we are dealing with a season of unknown and uncertainty. Let's end our time with talking about how do we find hope in the midst of uncertainty. Uncertainty, if I was to first acknowledge it, I think the first thing that you would hear people say is uncertainty kind of forces you to be present because that's the only thing that you know in that moment. I would actually reframe that as uncertainty allows us to be present. We spend probably the majority of our time, even not in moments of uncertainty, with being busy and being distracted. And not that those things aren't good. It's good to be busy. It's good to be productive. But how much does that distract us from just being present? Not only with the people in our life, but it distracts us from being present even within ourselves. And the further that we get away from being self-reflective and introspective, then the harder it is in seasons of hard to actually learn to go inward and self-soothe. So uncertainty actually allows us to be present. Take the time of uncertainty and focus on what is literally right in front of you. Take time to be introspective. Another way that we can find hope in the midst of uncertainty is creating stability. With so many things up in the air and so many questions, creating healthy stability in your life and for the people around you allows you to have a sense of hope. It gives you something to hold on to every day. Take intentional action. Hope does not just mean sitting and thinking about the things that you are hopeful for. Oftentimes, hope requires action. I think even scripture talks about that. But putting some of those things that create a sense of hope into intentional action are important. A great example of this would be, think of something that gives you a sense of hope. And what would that end goal look like? And simply start with step one. What is step one that I can take intentional action towards that will make me feel like I have a sense of control and that I'm making progress, but also every day that I'm taking these small intentional actions, it gives me a sense of hope, right? Fourth, allow hope to serve as an anchor. In the midst of everything else, hope is our anchor. It is the thing that we can come back to and allow us to survive things going unanswered and things being unknown. Hope is something that I would say is probably in the top like 3 things that get talked about the most in my time in therapy with clients, is that finding a sense of purpose and a sense of hope when you are hurting or grieving or struggling in any way is probably the most important thing to our mental health. Finding a sense of hope and a sense of purpose, asking yourself things like, what does give me hope? What makes my life meaningful? Those questions are what allow us to get through the unanswered seasons of life. And lastly, and I think this is going to be, again, a very difficult thing, but a really incredible thing if you can do this, and that is learning to accept that hope and uncertainty can coexist. We tend to live in very either or headspaces, very black and white. We are either being a really good, healthy Christian because I don't have any of these struggles and I'm not questioning things and I'm not feeling anxious. Or if I am feeling those things, then I must be doing something wrong and this is how it will always be. We're not always aware of it, but we do tend to go to this very either or mentality. And I think it's really important to hear therapeutically, something that we talk about a lot in sessions is learning to accept that both can coexist within me. I can be in a season where things feel really up in the air and I have more questions than I have answers, and yet I can still hold hope that I'm going to be able to have the resiliency to get through this, that my hope serves as an anchor while I'm still questioning things. What we call this is dialectic thinking. And that's basically taking these two very opposing things and accepting that they can coexist together. I can accept the fact that I'm a good parent, and sometimes I lose my cool with my kids. I can accept that I still struggle with things like anxiety and depression, but I can also accept that I am a constant growth and healing person. All the time I'm growing and healing, and I'm working and progressing, but there's also still some things that I'm working on. My hope can exist with my uncertainty. So it is okay if you wake up tomorrow and the next day and the next day, and you are still feeling some anxiety around the uncertainty of life. And then taking that breath and being able to acknowledge the hope that you still experience in the midst of that uncertainty. So just to kind of wrap up, final thoughts on everything that I just named. Worrying keeps you stuck, and it absolutely impacts your mental health. So start to pay attention to when you're in that worry cycle. Second, you can learn to tolerate uncertainty instead of avoiding it. One of my favorite things to teach clients is the idea of resiliency. So again, healing doesn't necessarily look like you're getting rid of things. Sometimes what healing looks like is building up a resiliency or a tolerance to when things are hard, I'm able to deal with it, adapt, survive it. Third, remember that hope and uncertainty can absolutely coexist. Remember that underneath our anxiety is simply fear. It's fear of the unknown. It's fear of things not being in our control. So sometimes it's about taking what you're feeling anxious about and asking yourself that question underneath, and what is it that I'm afraid of? Hope allows us to see other possibilities. When we are anxious, when we are focused on the thing that is unknown or uncertain, or that we have anxiety, it's almost like having tunnel vision. Everything becomes very black and white, and it's this very myopic view of life and of that situation. We zero in on the thing that we're anxious about or that is unknown, and it creates this tunnel vision. What hope does is it's almost like taking the lens off, and suddenly I have the ability to see the big picture, to see other possibilities, other perspectives. That is what hope does. Hope allows us to accept that there are other options, other possibilities, other perspectives. And that is a very beautiful and freeing thing. And lastly, bringing back in Philippians 4, 6, and 7, hope and faith help so much during uncertainty. So when in doubt, let hope and faith be your anchor. So I have some questions that I want you to sit with, since I'm not able to be with you in person to answer some questions. I thought these would be some really great questions to either discuss today, or at the very least, even in addition to that, take these questions as something to reflect on over the next few days, the next few weeks. I would even say let these be questions that you continuously come back to and reflect on and notice. Question number 1 is, how do I deal with uncertainty? And I want you to, instead of being quick to answer that, to really imagine taking a step back from yourself and kind of think about your life and be willing to, just from an objective lens, notice, how do I typically deal with uncertainty? Number 2, how do I avoid? Because remember, avoidance is tricky. We don't always see what we're doing as avoidance. That example that I gave of what worry looks like. So when we go to problem solving, we don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, but sometimes it's important to acknowledge that that is a form of avoidance. And it's, how do I avoid, and what is it that I'm avoiding? Number 3, how can I create stability during uncertainty? This, I think, is helpful just even amongst you to be able to share and collaborate and brainstorm and give each other support around, how can I, within my family or in my community, how can I help create stability in the midst of uncertainty? What are some practical ways that I can do that? And lastly, where or how can I anchor my hope? So where might be things like, where in my life can I anchor hope, but the how might be the more practical ways of how I can remind myself of anchoring my hope. I so appreciate you guys letting me be here today. And again, I'm sure this goes without saying, but the Counseling Center has amazing therapists that would love to be able to be a support system to you. So please feel free to reach out to the Counseling Center. I believe Jackie has my contact information, but for any of you that are on social media, I do have a mental health Instagram account. It's just Danielle Fitch Therapy. So find me on Instagram. Please feel free to follow. I love bringing information into social media to help destigmatize what mental health is. So feel free to follow along. Reach out if you have questions. But more than anything today, just please, please, please have compassion for yourself, that if in the midst of uncertainty you have been fighting a lot of anxiousness, take time today and over the next few days from a place of compassion and not judgment to notice how this time of uncertainty has been impacting you and what are the ways that you can create some healthy coping skills around that and lean on each other, stay in community. Again, so happy to be here. And again, please reach out if you guys need anything.